We now move to the next keynote, which is from London Bullion Markets Association CEO, Ms. Ruth Crowell. Before I request Ms. Ruth to deliver a keynote, which would be on advancing global standards, it's my pleasure to read out a brief introduction. Ms. Crowell was appointed as the CEO of LBMA in January 2014. She is responsible for the success and strategic development of LBMA in partnership with the chairman and the board. Prior to joining LBMA, she worked in bank finance and US corporate law and also acted as a monitor at the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. Ms. Ruth Crowell has a MSc in History of International Relationship from the London School of Economics and a degree in English Literature from Kenyon College, Ohio. I now request Ms. Ruth Crowell to deliver her keynote. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vatsa. I really appreciate the kind welcome, and a big thank you to the organizers and the LBMA for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about our standards work, as well as responsible sourcing generally, our Gold Bar Integrity Initiative, and third but not least, Basel III, because I've been getting an enormous amount of questions about this, and so I definitely want to take you through. Vatsa, do you want me to share screen, or can you go to the next slide?
We will move the screen. Please.
Perfect. Okay. So I think in terms of those who aren't familiar with us, we're the independent authority for precious metals, and it's our job to set standards for the common good of the global industry. And we also look to put forward market-led solutions. And this year is very much about standards. We're consulting on two of our major standards this year. One is London Good Delivery from a responsible sourcing perspective, and the second is a Global Precious Metals Code. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the responsible sourcing program first and foremost. I think for those of you who are here, and I'm so happy that the APPMC put this program together, because I really wish we could be meeting in person because it's been far too long. But it's nice to bridge that gap between the in-person meetings and have some discussions about the work that's been going on, albeit in a virtual capacity over the last year or so. I think you're all very familiar with our responsible sourcing program. This is mandatory for the 100 or so LBMA good delivery refiners, and we've been running it since 2012. This year, if you go to the next slide, we are consulting on the next chapter of the guidance. And we have done the first round of consultation, which launched earlier this month, and we're asking for feedback by the 20th of July. We'll have a second round that happens in the fall, but given that this is a substantial change to the guidance, we want to make sure that there's sufficient time and attention from the industry, as well as feedback from other actors like government, civil societies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the main points we're looking to achieve and why, but please make your voice heard. We've got a webinar next week to really go through this in detail. And if you need your own one-to-one, we'd be delighted to hear from everyone in the industry. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the major things that are included. So version 9, I think no surprise, ESG is a major point. We first introduced ESG with the last version in 2018. But really there has been calls for more clarity and detail as to what refiners are doing, but also what's being done at a mine level. The other aspect is about clarity on the true origin of material, and in particular, ensuring that due diligence approaches on recycled gold are uniform across the industry. The first 3 points we've really included as part of our International Bullion Center's recommendations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those are, why we're doing them, and why it's something that the industry can all benefit from. If you go to the next slide, please. As part of our commitment to transparency, which was one of the major feedbacks we had from stakeholders, including the EU, as part of our application to be recognized under the laws that came into place in January this year, we published our first annual report in September. I'd encourage you to have a look at it. We give an overview of what we do, the program for those non-industry players who don't necessarily understand this, the LBMA and the standards it set. But we also included country of origin information for all the gold and silver that flows through those 100 LBMA good delivery refiners. At the request of some of the government, we also gave transparent information on the country of destination where possible. We had to have at least 3 refiners in a country to do that. And I think what was very interesting is that we broke this material down. So not just gold and silver, but is it large scale mine? Is it artisanal mine? Or is it recycled? Probably the main thing you'll notice here is that there's a lot of green on this. And I think we were also struck, as were others, that it was the majority coming through. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and certainly from an environmental impact, there is a preference by some downstream users, certainly for recycled. But there are concerns that this might not be the true origin of this material, and if various gold trading centers are approaching recycled in different ways, we as an industry have some risk. If you go to the next slide, we also analyze the data in terms of where it's going to and the type. So we broke down those 3 types of material, and then we further broke them down in terms of what is local, regional, and international material coming in. And so what's really interesting here is where you have the orange, particularly on the recycled. And that's where you're trading with material that is further away from the point of origin. And that's where we really put a call out in terms of how can we lead and act as a leader for the industry to address these things holistically, with the intention of eliminating gold laundering and ensuring a positive reputation for the whole industry. So I think the last time I saw you all in person, we launched our strategic plan for responsible sourcing. That was at the Shenzhen conference in 2019. And part of that is our commitment to certainly improve our standard, and that's what the new version is about. But the other is to be a leader and to say, 10 years on from when these laws were drafted, there has been really no change on the ground in places like Congo of breaking the link between gold and conflict. Is there something we can do as an industry to change that? And that's where we tried to look in terms of building leverage and working together. And that led us to launching the International Bullion Center's recommendations that we put out last year. If you go to the next slide. So this was launched in November and a call to 12 centers and asking for, yes, industry support, but really support for industry from national authorities as well as civil society to look at 3 strategic priorities. One is, how do we deal with recycled gold and make sure that there's the right level of controls for the right type of material? We all know that there are also low risk types of recycled gold, particularly electronic, and to try to make sure that those controls are tailored. The other is looking at reduction of cash transactions and support for ASM. And if you go to the next slide, I'm happy to say that we've had strong support from all 12 centers. In particular, we were happy to see that there was a request for an intergovernmental meeting hosted by the OECD of these 12 centers, where the LBMA spoke on its recommendations, and it was joined by the Financial Action Task Force. So work is ongoing. They've committed to continue to discuss these issues and also look at practical things, such as the Swiss government's suggestion in terms of a revision of customs codes to help make it easier for both industry and government to know the type of material that's coming in and have that being consistent. If you go to the next slide. So I think with that, that's a high level on responsible sourcing. The main thing you need to know is that we're consulting on the next version. We really want to hear from you, but I wanted to give a little feedback and an overview as to the strategic, what we're doing and why. And part of this is really driven by to ensure that we are recognized, not just by the industry, but at an EU level as well, given its legislation coming in place, that came in place this year. If I bring quickly to the Precious Metals Code, we drafted this 4 years ago. This is the major updates 4 years on. We're delighted to see that the list of companies that are attesting to the code continues to grow. Yes, this is something that is done that LBMA members do, but also we keep track and publicly recognize any industry body or industry player that attests to the code. So we really encourage you to give us your feedback if you go to next slide on the next version that's coming out this year. And the major points that are included, I think no surprise, are ESG, the EU responsible minerals regulation. Again, this is how downstream users in particular meet these requirements. And the other aspects, diversity, inclusion, and I think contingency planning. I think as someone who certainly has enjoyed the benefits of working from home, but definitely looking forward to some in-person meetings and innovation, contingency planning is another part when it comes to what controls should be in place for remote working, particularly when there's remote trading going on. So encourage you to feedback and get involved when that goes live later this year. If I go to the next slide, I think the other thing I can't not mention while we're sort of still talking about the more downstream financial users, and that's Basel III. We've had, I think, questions on this in every meeting I've had for the last month or so. And some of those questions is, what can Asia do in terms of getting ready for this? I think the main point would be to support the lobbying efforts in the 3 jurisdictions that I've noted here. The main case and argument we have made is that when these rules were set in 2009, gold was not accurately treated. And part of that is because there wasn't data. We now have trade data, and we have trade data as well, thanks to the COVID crisis, of gold performance during volatile periods. With that data, the EU has agreed to do a review of the case of how precious metals is treated, and we'll get that update from that review in November. The UK is at a later stage, so January next year. That's because of Brexit, ongoing. And I think many of you would have seen our joint position paper that we put out. If you haven't, I'd encourage you just have a look at the executive summary. You don't need to see the full liquidity study because it's a bit long, but the beginning does talk about the risks. And then finally, when it comes to the Basel III International, really making the case, asking your governments to make the case at Basel that gold should be treated as a high quality liquid asset that we all know it is. I think the other questions we get asked is in terms of what will happen, what's the impact, what's being done. I think one thing to know is that this is something that has been coming since 2019. So many institutions have put things in place already. There is a risk to liquidity and financing, and our concerns is that there will be less financing options available. So the main point in terms of what can be done is certainly to support the regulators getting this right. But I think it's to rest assured that your bullion partners in terms of on a financing level are doing all they can to get ready for it as well. If I can go to my final, going into my final slides here. Gold bar integrity. This is a project that we're doing to put digital arms around the chain of integrity. We launched the security feature last year in terms of the standards. We're looking at applications. And then the other aspect this year is about how those security features feed into a global vault database, which covers kilobars and 400-ounce bars. There'll be more coming later in this year in terms of exactly what that includes, but really appreciate the support of all the industry actors in this program and excited to bring new digital transparency and integrity to the supply chain. So thanks for the involvement. If you'd like to hear more, we'd be happy to work with you. Next slide. I think the one thing, we're sad that we can't come together in person for the LBMA conference, but we do want to bring the conference to you, very much similar to what APPMC has done. We will be having a virtual conference in September. We're also going to be hosting a local London reception. We would encourage other major centers such as Singapore, if you're able to host your own reception, and we will look at ways that we can link those up and try to make them as seamless and together as we can. In this time where we can't be in person, we look forward to seeing everyone in Lisbon in 2022. But until that point, we'd encourage you to meet virtually and hope to see you again in September. So in conclusion, the main points I wanted to say is responsible sourcing, gold guidance. Please get your voice heard. The same with the Global Precious Metals Code, and hope to see you and give updates on all of this at our conference in September. Thank you so much to the organizers and to the SBMA. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ruth. It was so much packed with information in just 15 minutes. Wonderful. And here is an opportunity to all the delegates who are there to give your consultations, comments on two important aspects. One is Responsible Gold Guidance version 9 and also Global Precious Metal Code. And thanks also for covering in detail about Basel III and its likely repercussion openly. Hope it clears some of the points in the mind of the delegates, and they know what to do, like, from their respective positions and from their respective government. Thank you so much for your presence and for your keynote address. Thank you so much. Thank you. With this, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of the inaugural session of APPMC 2021. A big thanks to both our keynote speakers and of course our beloved chairman, SBMA.